Few people know, but in a small hidden town in the southern United States, there is a place that time seems to have forgotten. A leper colony. A heavy name, isn't it? It feels like something out of the past. But it isn't. There live men and women who once had families, dreams, plans, and who suddenly were forced to disappear from society. People often imagine that leprosy, now called Hansen's disease, is an extinct illness. But that's not quite true. In the middle of the 20th century, when there was still much fear and little knowledge, those diagnosed were taken far away. Some hospitals treated the disease, but other places, well, they were more like prisons disguised as sanctuaries. Places where the sick could live in peace, which actually meant living in forgetfulness. The St. Helena colony in Louisiana is one of those places. Founded decades ago, it has become a world of its own, with its own rules, its own routines, and a heavy silence that seemed to cling to the walls. Inside, the days pass slowly. The same voices, the same faces marked by time and disease. And hope? That left a long time ago. Many who live there barely remember what it's like to be touched by another person. A handshake, a hug, simple gestures that for most are natural, but for them have become an unreachable luxury. Over time, some have stopped looking into each other's eyes, as if they wanted to disappear completely. As if it were easier to accept oblivion than to continue dreaming of something that might never happen again. Nurse Margaret Wells is one of the few who hasn't given up on them. For years, she has walked those corridors, holding trembling hands, telling stories to those who have lost the will to speak. She has seen many leave. She has seen others arrive already without hope. But despite everything, she has stayed. Because, for Margaret, they are not just patients. They are people who still have worth, even if the world refuses to see them. And then, one day, something unexpected happened. News began to circulate, first as a whisper, then as a rumor impossible to ignore. They said a very special visitor was on the way, not a doctor, not a politician, but someone no one would ever imagine seeing there. Pope Francis. At first, almost no one believed it. Why would he come here? To see who? For what? The residents of the colony had already learned not to build expectations. Life had taught them, in the cruelest way possible, that expecting too much almost always leads to disappointment. But still, something inside them, something very small and nearly forgotten, began to stir. Could it be? Could they, for just one day, be seen as human beings again? In the following days, the rumor continued to spread. At first, many laughed at the idea. Pope Francis, here, in St. Helena? It had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps a story made up by someone wanting to add a splash of color to the monotony of that place. But then, the confirmation came. It was true. The news arrived through the hands of Margaret Wells. She herself doubted when she received the official information. The Vatican had organized the visit. Francis wanted to go there. Not for a big event, not for speeches, not for cameras, but just to be with them. Simply that. When Margaret announced the news to the residents, silence was the first reaction. No one knew what to say. Some looked stunned, others simply shook their heads, as if refusing to believe. But there was something in their eyes, something Margaret hadn't seen in a long time. A different shine, a spark of hope trying to rekindle. But along with hope, fear also arrived. What if it were just an empty promise? What if he changed his mind? Many there had already tasted the bitter flavor of disappointment. And even if Francis actually came, how would he react upon seeing them? Seeing the deformed faces, the fingerless hands, the scars that told stories of pain and abandonment? Joseph Carter, one of the oldest residents, murmured softly, "He won't want to look at us. No one ever does." And in a way, that was the thought of many. Would the Pope, one of the most influential men in the world, really have the courage to approach? To touch them? Meanwhile, the colony began to stir like it hadn't in years. Some tried to tidy up the small spaces where they lived, as if they could somehow erase the marks of time. Others avoided any discussion about the matter, afraid of building expectations. But everyone, on some level, felt the same thing. A knot in their stomach, a silent anxiety for the day that was to come. And meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, Pope Francis was also preparing. He had visited prisons, slums, refugee camps. But St. Helena would not be just another stop. He knew that this visit would be one of the most important moments of his life. What he didn't know was that for those residents, it would be a day that changed everything. The day finally arrived. From the early hours of the morning, the colony was restless. Some residents tried to pretend that nothing was happening, continuing their routines as usual. Others, however, were different. They wore their best clothes, which were really just the same clothes they always had, but freshly washed and arranged. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, they wanted to be seen. Then a distant sound began to approach. First, a barely perceptible hum in the sky. Then a more intense noise making many hearts race. The papal helicopter had arrived. The aircraft landed in an open field just a few meters from the colony, and for a moment everything fell silent. Nobody knew what to expect. Nobody knew how to act. That moment felt like a dream. When the door of the helicopter opened, the figure of Francis emerged. No formalities, no ceremonies. He wore his simple white robe, the same calm smile on his face. He looked ordinary, but at the same time there was something about him that made it impossible to look away. Margaret Wells was the first to approach. Her eyes were misty, but her voice came out strong as she welcomed him. Francis held her hands tenderly as if he had known her for years. But he didn't stay there for long. He wanted to see the residents. He wanted to see them up close. And it was when he took his first steps toward the group that something happened. Nobody moved. Some lowered their heads, others stared at the ground. The fear, the shame, everything they had carried for years came to the surface in that moment. What would Francis do upon seeing those faces marked by disease? Upon noticing the fingerless hands, the skin deformed by time? However, Francis kept walking, and then he did something no one expected. He stopped in front of the first resident he encountered. He didn't say anything, he just smiled and extended his hand. Without hesitation. Without fear. And at that moment, something began to change. It was not just a handshake. It was not just a gesture. It was the first step towards something that nobody there would ever forget. For an instant, nobody breathed. Pope Francis extended his hand, but the man in front of him hesitated. His name was Joseph Carter. He had been there so long that he had lost count of the years. The mirror had never been his friend. And over time, he stopped looking at himself. He knew exactly what people saw when they looked at him. And it was not something beautiful. Joseph took a step back instinctively. He lowered his head, ashamed. He knew what would happen. Francis would notice the remnants of his face, the missing fingers on his trembling hand, and, like everyone else, he would hesitate. He would pretend that it didn't bother him but would step away. It was always like that. Always. But Francis didn't hesitate, not for a second. Instead, he stepped forward. A firm step. And then, without saying a single word, he embraced him. Time seemed to stop. No sound, no movement. Joseph froze. Nobody had touched him that way in decades. Decades. His body was no longer used to the warmth of another human being. But there he was, in the arms of the Pope. And Francis did not let go. That was when Joseph felt something he didn't expect. Tears came before he even realized he was crying. First, it was a sob caught in his throat. Then his whole body surrendered to that silent cry, suffocated by so many years of loneliness. He tried to pull away, but Francis tightened his embrace as if to say, "I am here." And then, like a domino effect, other residents began to cry as well. It was impossible to hold back. They saw in that embrace something they never imagined they would witness. It wasn't pity, it wasn't obligation, it was love. That day, in that exact moment, Joseph Carter was no longer just a patient. He was a man, he was human, and for the first time in a long time, he felt worthy of being loved. After that embrace, something changed in the colony. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was there. A different atmosphere. A silence that was no longer filled with fear, but with something new. Something that no one knew exactly how to name. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was faith. Or maybe it was simply the shock of feeling truly seen after so much time living on the margins of the world. Francis did not stop with Joseph. He went to each one of them. He touched weathered faces, held frail hands, looked into the eyes of those who had long since learned to avert their gaze. And the most astonishing thing? He never hesitated. He never recoiled. To him, there was nothing there that needed to be avoided, nothing that repulsed him. Some cried, others smiled for the first time in years. And there were those who simply stood there in silence, trying to understand what they were feeling. Because after all, what was happening was not a miracle in the traditional sense. There were no sudden healings, no heavenly lights, no physical transformations, but something inside them was changing, something that nobody could ever erase. Nurse Margaret Wells watched everything with misty eyes. She knew those people like no one else. She knew their fears, their pains, their stories. She knew that many there had learned to hide not because they wanted to, but because it was the only way to survive. And yet, that day, they stood there, receiving something that had always been denied to them: a touch, a gaze, a gesture of unconditional love. Then something unexpected happened. A man named Elliot, who never spoke, who spent his days sitting on the same bench with his head down. He began to sing. A fragile voice, almost a whisper, but full of emotion. First, it was just him. Then another joined in. And then another, and another, until the entire colony was enveloped in a gentle melody, filled with something that no one there knew they still had inside themselves. Francis merely smiled, listening to every note, every word. He knew he didn't need to say anything. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not the ones that can be seen, but the ones that can be felt. That day, no one was cured of leprosy, but everyone was healed of something far deeper: the feeling that they would never again be worthy of love. And this, perhaps, was the greatest healing of all. The sun was beginning to set when Francis announced that he had to leave. And for the first time in a long time, the entire colony wished that time would slow down. No one wanted that day to end, because deep down, there was a silent fear. What if everything went back to how it was before? What if, when he left, the world forgot about them once again? The residents gathered around him, unsure of what to say. Some held his hands, while others simply looked on as if they wanted to engrave every detail of that moment in their memories. Francis noticed this, and he smiled, as if understanding that sometimes words are unnecessary. But before he left, he looked at each of them and spoke with a firm yet tender voice. "You are not forgotten. Not by God, not by me. True love does not turn away from pain. It embraces it." There was silence, and then someone began to clap. First hesitantly, then more robustly. Soon, everyone was applauding. But it wasn't applause for a religious leader, for an important man. It was applause for something much greater. It was for everything they had felt that day. It was applause for themselves. When the helicopter took off, no one left right away. They just stood there, looking at the sky, still trying to understand what had happened. But deep down, each one knew that something had changed. Because for the first time in decades, they no longer felt invisible. The following days were different. People from outside began to visit the colony. Volunteers arrived. Donations appeared. The story of that day spread around the world, but more than that, something remained within them. The touch, the gaze, the embrace. Francis had gone, but what he left behind could never be erased, because it wasn't just a visit. It was a reminder that no one deserves to live in forgetfulness. Months passed, but within the St. Helena colony, that day was never forgotten. On the contrary, it remained alive in the glances, the gestures, the small changes that meant everything for those who lived there. And nobody felt that change more than Joseph Carter. Before Pope Francis's visit, Joseph hardly spoke. He avoided mirrors, avoided conversations, avoided being noticed. But something inside him changed during that embrace. It wasn't a physical healing, but a silent transformation, almost imperceptible to others, but monumental for him. For the first time in many years, he believed that his life still had value. And that was how Joseph began to do something he had never imagined: helping others. He started to visit newcomers to the colony, those who arrived scared, hopeless, with the same expression he once carried. He would sit beside them, hold their hands, and say, "You are still someone. You still deserve to be loved." He also began to share his story with volunteers, with doctors, with anyone who wanted to listen. He wanted the world to know what happened that day because, for him, that visit was not just an event, it was a rebirth. Years went by and Joseph grew old, but until his last day, he never stopped remembering. He never forgot that moment, that embrace, that instant when, after decades in forgetfulness, he felt seen, he felt important, he felt human. And when, finally, Joseph departed, it was not as a man abandoned by the world. He left as someone who had been loved, someone who had been touched by unconditional love without fear, without barriers, without limits. Because, in the end, it was not the disease that defined his life. It was that instant when he was embraced and finally felt whole. Stories like Joseph's remind us of something very important. No one should ever feel forgotten. No one should carry the pain of loneliness, abandonment, the feeling of being without value. Perhaps we will never have the chance to change someone's life with a gesture as powerful as Pope Francis's, but what if we could change a day? What if a simple hug, a kind word, a true look could make someone feel human again? Type your comment. If this story touched your heart, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Tell me, what moment moved you the most? Because in the end, it's stories like this that remind us what really matters. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.